Hello and welcome, I'm Maria from Sew Through Time, and this time we're getting dressed in round gowns from 1770s to 1790s. Most gowns throughout the 18th century were so-called open gowns, meaning that the skirts were open in the front, showing a visible petticoat underneath. Whereas a round gown is what we would consider nowadays a dress, with the skirt portion completely closed and no visible petticoats. No matter what era's round gown you're starting to get dressed in, your base layer is your linen shift. As your underwear layer, this protects your outer garments from body fluids and oils. Linen is also excellent at wicking away moisture, keeping you nice and dry, while being a poor breeding ground for bacteria, keeping you from smelling sweaty. The other essential part of your base layer is your stockings held up by garters. The stockings could be wool, silk, cotton, or linen. Though hand-knit stockings, especially for wintertime, were popular, most stockings were in fact store-bought and frame-knit. And next comes your stays. This is basically the garment that we nowadays refer to as a corset, though the word corset in the 18th century meant a completely different garment. Stays were worn throughout the 18th century, and they were essentially your 18th century bra. This is the foundation layer that brings that conical shape that is so indicative of the 18th century. Stays were typically made by stay makers, which is its own guild separate from the tailors or the dressmakers or mantua makers of the era. Instead of the crisscross lacing of later corsets, 18th century stays close with spiral lacing. In the beginning of the 18th century, these were fully boned, very heavily boned with baleen garments that created that very conical torso that created a very smooth front in the front. By the 1770s and 1780s, most of these garments are only half boned, and by the 1790s, they become even less boned than previously. And while in the 1770s and 1780s, it does still create that conical shape, there is a lot of emphasis also on bust thrust. So that means your bust is thrust forward and gives that kind of curve to the front top, instead of going to the sides to help create that conical shape. And in these stays, straps are absolutely necessary to help create that forward thrust. In the 1790s, as the waistlines of the gowns creeps higher and higher, the emphasis of that waistline lessens, so the stays actually end at your natural waist, unlike previously. And that conical shape all but disappears, and the whole emphasis is on that forward thrust of that bust area. While many different kinds of strap options were available in the 18th century, my personal favorite is the one that I'm using in both of these stays. So it is ribbon straps that basically tie around your back, and then you either tie them in place or you secure them with hooks. And a wooden busk is used to keep that center front tummy area straight and distribute the pressure evenly, helping keep the stays comfortable throughout the day. Wooden busks were used ever since a foundational garment resembling a corset came into use, and it was used all the way until the split busk was invented in the very late 1830s. And even beyond until the 1860s, when the split busk finally completely replaces it. And next comes the under petticoat. For the 1770s and 1780s, this is typically worn underneath the stays. You could put it on before you put on the stays, but because I personally find the knot sometimes bothersome and it gets trapped underneath the stays and it can cause a pressure point, I prefer to put it on after the stays. By the time we get to the mid-1790s, the style of the gowns has changed to that high-waisted empire waistline, and the petticoat changes right along with it, because that skirt-like garment that ends at your natural waist no longer makes any sense. So in this era, petticoats are either held up with straps, or they have a full bodice to them, or a partial bodice. And because my outer gown is completely sheer, I chose a bodice petticoat. Though because of those strong classical influences in fashion, ladies of the upper class, especially in France, could sometimes be seen walking around with just their petticoat on. So basically, dressed in a way that would never get past the modern day community guidelines. And because the silhouette is drastically different in the 1770s and 1780s, there you would wear a false rump. In the late 1770s, the emphasis is not only on the back, but also on the hips themselves. So the rump comes a lot further in the sides, creating wider hips than the 1780s one, where the focus of the padding is very much on that center rear area. In the 1770s and 1780s, separate pockets were worn underneath the dress. These could be accessed through the slits in the skirts. These separate pockets meant that you didn't need to make pockets for each gown. So you could fill them with all the stuff that you need with you, much like a purse, and then you could put whatever clothing you were actually going to put on that day, and you didn't have to switch out the contents of the pocket if you changed garments. That high waistline of the late 1790s meant that you couldn't really wear a pocket with it, so most often women would wear reticules, a little bag, instead. For the 1780s, I add another petticoat because my gown is sheer, so it's going to be slightly visible through the gown. Whereas for the 1770s, I finally get to that round gown. This type of round gown first came into fashion in the 1740s. It was a variation on the nightgown or English gown. That means a gown that has the pleats in the back sewn onto the gown, as opposed to the free-flowing pleats of the French or a sackback gown. It came about mainly as a way of saving on those expensive brocaded silk fabrics, since you didn't have both the dress skirts and the petticoat to make out of that same brocade. And like a lot of these 1770s versions of this gown, because it was a retro style, they also used retro fabrics. So this sort of brocade would have been in the height of fashion in the 1740s. So it's basically the 18th century version of fashionable vintage. The biggest difference is that in the 40s, they would have had a separate stomacher piece in the front, and they would have had much more sleeve ruffles. And as you can see, the skirt closes in the front just like a petticoat. It ties in the back behind the gown, and then the gown goes over that. As for the late 1790s gown, it is the same kind of gown as the bodice petticoat, so it closes with drawstrings in the front. And in this era, it was very common to have trained gowns, even for day wear. Instead of being a continuation of that earlier 1770s style, this is basically a newer version of the chemise à la reine, which is the 1780s gown that I'm wearing. As the name implies, it is very much inspired by the chemise or shift that was the underwear of the era. This style first came about in the Caribbean and from there spread to the Western world. They could be drawstring gathered throughout or have a fitted back like mine, and in the 1790s the fitted back wins. The biggest difference between the chemise gown and later round gowns is that the chemise gown typically has a drawstring at the waistline, whereas the later round gowns either have only one at the top or one at the top and one just below the bust line. Mine doesn't have that because they are typically usually tied with belts, so the belt does the same effect. Because this ribbon belt is red, I'm tying it à la victime, which was inspired by the victims of the guillotine. It seems to have started out as a political statement, but then it just became fashionable. The 1770s gown closes with straight pins just like most 18th century gowns do. This pinning shut rather than having permanent closures allows for a lot of adjustability, and the pin goes through the fabric of the gown and the lining and then through the stays outer fabric, and the boning protects you and keeps you from being poked. This provides a very secure closure, and at the same time it allows for much more adjustability than buttons or hooks and eyes. The 80s chemise gown still has that fitted lining reminiscent of the earlier styles, even though the outer fabric is completely loose and just gathers in with the drawstrings. The lining on mine closes with ribbons, allowing for, again, much more adjustability than even pins would. As long as the shoulders are similar in size, this gown can fit a huge variety of body sizes. But because of the implication of underwear, it was seen as somewhat scandalous and definitely more casual wear. This would not be appropriate for the most formal events. Though chemise appropriate balls were in fact held, and in a lot of masquerades it was acceptable. In the 1770s, ribbon bows in the front were very common since that front is rather plain. And at my waist, I'm adding a pair of chatelaines, which hold my watch, and decorative charms. For the 90s, I chose hooped pearl earrings, which were common throughout the 18th century, and a cameo brooch for the neckline. For the 80s, I chose pearl hoops, and a ribbon for my hair. Meanwhile, the 70s get a pearl necklace and silk mitts. These provide warmth and sun protection. Next comes my shoes. For most of the 18th century, they are buckle-on style. In the 80s, a heeled slipper style emerges, and in the 90s, the heel has mostly disappeared. In the 80s and early 90s, 17th century revival style hats were hugely popular. Since it sits kind of on top of my hair, I secure it in place with a hat pin. Sash belts, inspired by deshabille and Turkish dress, were hugely popular in the 80s and 90s. In the late 70s and early 80s, hemlines are rather short, usually showing the ankle, whereas in the later part of the 80s and 90s, they go in the exact opposite direction and trains become the norm. Down in the comments, I'd love to hear which version of this style do you like the most. And for weather protection, I chose for the 70s and 80s a silk mantle. Mantles and cloaks were the standard outer garment for most of the 18th century. By the 90s, the spencer emerges. And for the 90s headwear, I chose a bonnet. And in the late 70s, the muffs become rather huge, and they continue that way throughout the Regency era. They keep both your hands and arms nice and toasty. Well, folks, that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope to see you again next time. Bye!